Hello, my name is Mark Saunders, and this is a YouTube video presentation on qualitative research designs and research onion. And within this, we'll be looking mainly at qualitative research designs in terms of methodological choice. And people often ask me, what about the pictures? How do you choose images? Well, clearly in this image here and in images in this presentation, we're seeing images of onions, as in the research onion, but we're also seeing images that suggest counting and standardization, I hope. In this video presentation, we're looking at quantitative, mono and multi-method research designs, and we're going to start off by giving a few definitions and understanding exactly what we mean by mono and multi-method. We'll then go into more detail looking at where they fit within the research onion, and in particular the associated philosophies and approaches to theory development, and we'll touch on methodological choice before returning to it later. We'll then spend a bit of time on the characteristics of quantitative designs before returning to methodological choice and looking at mono and multi-method quantitative research designs. We'll finish up by talking about what quantitative research designs can offer us as researchers, and finish with some references and further reading. Quantitative mono-method research designs use a single quantitative data collection procedure and corresponding quantitative analysis techniques in the same project. So, for example, they may use something like a questionnaire and follow this up by analysing the data using graphs and charts. In contrast, quantitative multi-method designs, notice it's only one method rather than methods, so there's no S on method, use two or more quantitative data collection procedures and corresponding analysis techniques, again in the same project. So what we see here is a variety of data collection procedures, all of which are related to quantitative, such as questionnaires, structured observations, and a variety of analysis techniques, such as graphs, charts, and statistics. And together we use these to generate numerical data in terms of questionnaires and structured observation, or we use them when we've got secondary data as well, which is quantitative, and then we use this numerical data in terms for our analysis. Let's look at quantitative research designs and how they fit within the research onion. And within this, I'm assuming that you already have a research question or an overall aim, so we're not going to be thinking of that. There are, of course, other video presentations that deal with this. We're going to look first of all at broader assumptions. We're going to be looking at the philosophy associated with quantitative research, and this is positivism, although it's interesting to note that it can also be associated with critical realism and pragmatism, but not so much, hence the dotted line. And then we're going to think about the approach to theory development. And here, quantitative research designs are very much associated with deduction, where we start with a theory and we collect quantitative data to test that theory statistically. In terms of specifics of methodological choice, quantitative data is very much associated with mono-method quantitative research and multi-method quantitative research, and we talked about the definitions of that earlier. So let's now look in detail at the philosophies associated with quantitative research designs. And going to look on this slide of two of them, positivism, which is in bold because it's the main one, and then pragmatism. And there will be a further slide looking at realism. So for these, the ontology, that's the nature of reality or being, in terms of positivism, is that reality is real, it's external to the researcher, and it's independent of researcher. And out there, we may not be able to see it, but there is one true reality, and this is known as universalism. And reality has an order and structure as to how things work. This contrasts with pragmatism, where reality is considered complex, rich, again external, but the reality for pragmatism is very much the practical consequences of the ideas. In terms of epistemology, that's what is acceptable knowledge. For positivists, they're very much like a scientist in a lab, white lab coat, working in a lab. They're looking at using a scientific method. Facts are things that are observable and measurable. They're looking to create law-like generalizations of what's happening, And to do this, they use numbers and causal explanation, or indeed prediction. And that's where the contribution of the research comes in, the explanation or the prediction. This contrasts with pragmatists, who are very much more interested in practical meanings, and they're very much concerned with these practical meanings in specific contexts to enable specific actions to happen, so for organisation improvement. So here the contribution is about problem solving and informing future practice, in effect improving practice. The axiology, or role of values, for positivists is that values, in terms of the way the research is done, is value-free. The research has to be therefore detached, neutral and independent, and maintain an objective stance. This contrasts with pragmatists who see themselves as value-driven. Their research is initiated by, and sustained actually, by doubts and beliefs, and they're reflexive, but it's always about looking for practical consequences and utility. The sorts... The typical procedures and techniques used by these two philosophies need to be contrasted as well. So let's look at positivism. Positivism is deductive, so it's starting with theory and collecting data to test it. And it's using highly structured procedures and techniques collected from large samples and measured. And so this is typically quantitative methods for positivism. In contrast, pragmatism uses a range of methods, and these are chosen in relation to the problem or question. So it's very much focused on answering the question, what methods are most appropriate for doing this. And here the focus is on practical outcomes and solutions. And this emphasises sometimes quantitative, sometimes qualitative, and sometimes mixed methods. So there's more choices within that. I said also that I'd talk about critical realism as one of the other philosophies where quantitative research is quite often undertaken. And so we're going to look at this in terms of its ontology, the nature of reality or being first. And for critical realism, reality is stratified and layered. So we can think of that as the empirical layer, what we can measure, the actual layer, what's out there, and then what's actually real beneath that. Very difficult to actually find. And this reality is external, independent of the researcher, and it's also intransient. The nature of what's acceptable knowledge is based within this idea that knowledge is historically constituted. Oh, fucking hell, this is not good, Mark. Let's stop this. The role of values is that based on the fact that critical realists believe that research is value laden, but, and this is crucial, the bias is acknowledged and researchers try to minimise this within critical realism and try to be as objective as they can. And the sorts of data that are used comprise a range of methods in terms of data collection analysis, and it's undertaken to fit the subject matter. So this means it can be quantitative data, or it can be qualitative data, or sometimes it can be both quantitative and qualitative data, in effect, multi-methods. The characteristics of quantitative research designs can be considered in a number of ways, but probably the most useful is to just run through this table and actually talk it through. First of all, within quantitative research, you as researcher are considered to be independent of what you're researching. So you are not part of what you're researching it as a distanced observer collecting data and so on. The people you're collecting data from are called respondents, and your research focuses on variables and understanding the relationships between those variables. When you're collecting data, you're invariably almost always collecting data from a sample, and you use probability sampling to collect this, or perhaps also quota samples, which are in fact part of a non-probability sample. But those are the main ones that are used. You're trying within your research to generalise statistically, so saying if I find this out in my sample using statistics, I can say on probability this is what's likely to be happening in the population. And to do that you're using highly rigorous data collection where you've defined the variables you want to collect data from precisely, and you have a very structured way of collecting it, such as the questionnaire with closed questions. The resultant data is numerical and it's standardised, so you're collecting the same data from every respondent or the same data about every organisation. And you're analysing this with statistics, graphs and charts, and the meaning you have is derived from the numbers and the pictures, which are numerical representations of your data. Let's look at our quantitative research designs, in effect our methodological choice on the research onion. The first of these is monomethod quantitative research, and what we see here is we have one method of data collection and then we analyse that statistically. So our one method could be a survey using a questionnaire, or our method could be structured observation, for example. So we have a variety of different methods we could choose. And what we do is we use these methods to either describe what's going on, or we could be using them to describe and generate hypotheses, or we could be using these methods to describe and test hypotheses, or we could be using them just to test hypotheses. So we have a variety of choices within that. When we look at multi-method quantitative research designs, in effect what we've got here is more than one method. So we could start off with structured observation, that's our first quantitative method, and then building on that we could use perhaps questionnaires. So two methods, one after the other. And it may be that the first method is used to describe and generate hypotheses, and then the second method is used to test these hypotheses. Alternatively, the first method may be very much focused on describing, and the second method may be much more focused on testing hypotheses. Let's look at what quantitative research designs can do. We use them to examine relationships between variables, and we use them to collect the data we use to examine the relationships in a standardised manner. So we collect the same data from a large sample, and we analyse these data using a range of statistical and graphical techniques. The data we're looking at, we're considering in terms of, is it valid, does it measure what we want it to do, and is it reliable in terms that we can repeat the collection and it will still give us the same answers. And to collect these data we often use probability sampling techniques, and we use these to ensure statistically generalisability. In other words, the data we've collected from our sample represents the population as a whole. And we use them in survey and experimental research strategies, amongst others. But there is a but with this, and there's always a but. We need to have a good depth of statistical knowledge to use quantitative research designs, and we're likely to be unitarist in that people who do quantitative research designs often believe that this is the way of collecting data. Some people don't, but the unitarist perspective is that there's one way of doing things. The other thing we have to be aware of, and there's a lovely paper on this in Human Relations by Yehuda Barak, is about Harkin, hypothesising after the results are known. And what this means is we collect a lot of data and we put it into a statistical analysis software, and we keep on analysing it until we find something that's statistically significant, and then we generate our hypotheses afterwards. You're probably wondering what's the picture got in relevance to quantitative data, and it's the idea of illustrating things in being in a standardised manner. So we have a standardised row of carrots, of aubergines, of tomatoes, and then onions in the distance, and this makes it easy to analyse statistically. In terms of references and further reading, Yehuda Barak's paper on Harkin, which I referred to in a previous slide, is the first reference, and this can be found in the journal Human Resource Management Journal. My book chapter with Fariba Darabi on using multi and mixed methods research designs obviously talks about mono and multi-method quantitative designs, and this may be useful particularly for those who are doing employment relations type research. And finally, the book Research Methods for Business Students, which I wrote with Phil and Adrian, has a lot of the material which I've been talking about here in chapters 4 and 5. I hope you found this presentation of use. If you have, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, Mark Saunders on Research Methods, where there are numerous other video presentations, including some on the Research Onion and various other aspects of methods. Thank you for listening.